Thank you all so very much for coming. I truly appreciate it. This is another landmark moment for the Barnum Museum. We are the busiest closed museum on the planet. And welcome home, Anita. A big round of applause for Anita. And just if you indulge me a moment, I just wanted you a huge shout out to the M&T Bank volunteers in the back in green shirts. Thank you all so much. They have been wonderful, and I am so grateful to them. I also want to thank all of the museum team. Stephanie is here. Oh my goodness, Joanne O'Neill was helpful in assembling all the books as well. Rena Bacalar, we go way back with Rena too. Everybody who I didn't mention. And a special just shout out to Bob Cardillo, who was part of the White House advance team when Anita and Mrs. Bush came in 2007. He's here tonight. There he is. Such a joy. You asked me last week for the guest list, who was coming, and I was sworn to secrecy by some of you in this room, so I've been keeping a secret from you because I know there were surprises.
There were many surprises tonight.
So,
thank you.
Yeah, so thank all of you for being here. It's just such a joy. This goes back to 18 years, to 2007, when the city of Bridgeport, Rena Bacalar, Karen Kaufman, city of Bridgeport and our neighboring towns received the largest National Endowment for the Arts Big Read grant. It was $40,000. And it was the kickoff event of the NEA's Big Read, and it was all coordinated through the mayor's office that First Lady Mrs. Bush was going to come and commemorate this, and so much of that had to do with you, but what a memory. This room was filled with Secret Service. It was incredible, and what a glorious event it was.
So it was terrific to come to Bridgeport and have Mrs. Bush here to kick off the Big Read, which was a nationwide program. But when you're in a position to be Chief of Staff for the First Lady, you can help direct the schedule a little bit. So I really helped to make Bridgeport the first stop. I thought it would be so great for the city, and the city was so engaged in it. The community adopted, I don't know if you remember what the Big Read was. It was a focus on some of the 5 of the best works of American literature, to promote those, get those back in the community, to get people to read these books, to discuss them, do book clubs, and people did creative things here in Bridgeport, in fact. So the book that Bridgeport selected was To Kill a Mockingbird. And I remember, we were so tickled, Mrs. Bush was so tickled when we were reading our briefings, that one of the local restaurants here in town, may have been Ralph and Rich's, I'm not sure, did a specialty cocktail for honoring the Big Read for Bridgeport, which they named Tequila Mockingbird. And it was just so cute. I mean, it just was a way, for the community to get involved in something that's good. And literature and, books, of course, are a great unifier.
Yeah, it was. And we did it 4 times, I think we did it 4 times, so it was quite a successful program. But before we begin with remembering the First Ladies, if you could just explain to everybody, too, you are on the America 250th Commission, because next year we're celebrating the country's 250th anniversary. We're part of the Connecticut. Tonight is the kickoff event for the Bridgeport 250th celebration. So it couldn't be more appropriate to have this event kick off, really one of the first in the state. So if you want to talk about the White House Historical Association, because you being a part of that, your daughter Gigi and you wrote these, some of you might have purchased it already, Gigi's remembrances of being in the White House as a child, and then you also did a children's book about the First Ladies. So let's start everybody young. Let's get people, ingratiated to this now. So if you want to.
Sure, I'll mention a little bit. These are really terrific. First of all, the book that Gigi wrote, Gigi at the White House, my daughter Giovanna, a lot of my cousins and family are here, and dear friends that know Gigi since she was born. She now just graduated Texas Christian University with an elementary school education degree. So this was a perfect exercise for her. But this was during the year of COVID. She was a freshman at college at TCU in Texas, and kids were sent home. And that was a tough time for all kids at every level to be so disrupted with their education. But she turned it into something positive. As Kathy mentioned, I'm on the board of the White House Historical Association, founded by a First Lady, Jackie Kennedy, in 1961, to be the private funding arm to support the White House to make sure it maintains the museum quality that it deserves. And we have a series of books, of publications, and children's books, but we didn't have any about First Ladies. But I had come home from a board meeting, and I had said to Gigi that what we heard was we were hearing from our retail customers were complaining that there really weren't enough children's books. Well, she said, I can write one. And she put a little storyboard together based on her memories and her recollections of visiting me when she was a little girl when I was chief of staff to the First Lady. So with a lot of her own memories, but photographs, these illustrations in the Gigi at the White House book are from actual photos of all her experiences visiting me at the White House. The only one we took license with was Gigi waving to Queen Elizabeth at the 2007 state dinner. She was not there for that. But the rest, meeting Olympians, coming to Halloween parties, Christmas parties. I mean, Mrs. Bush was really terrific in inviting the staff's children to come and experience the events at the White House, because she knew how much time we were spending away from our family, and which we did. I mean, the days were long, the years were short, and so I was so gratified that my daughter's memories were very positive of me being away from her so much, and away from my son too. But then this one, The First Lady Make History. So this book came out in 2021. So she was actually an author well before I was. The First Ladies Make History book we just published this year that we did together. We co-wrote together, taking the stories of First Ladies that are, in my book, to an elementary school and middle school level. We just don't study enough about these women in our history. They're sort of forgotten in a lot of our history books. So it's sort of our goal to share it at all ages.
The thought of being an inspiration to your daughter at such a young age, I mean, that's wonderful.
I'm grateful
for it. That is wonderful.
I really am.
But with that, so many of you have purchased the books. I think that we only have one left, so but I've had the joy of reading it, that we can go back and forth with some of the comments. But what was interesting, and I was talking to one of my board members, Stephanie, a little earlier, I'm not a novel reader. I love this kind of nonfiction, and I found myself reading this book and creating an exhibition. So taking these stories and visualizing them into something that would be beyond, just the words, that this should become an extraordinary I know that there are exhibitions, but wow, the depth of these stories. And with that, I thought we'd start off with a Lady Bird Johnson quote, which made me realize this is the entry point to this conversation, if you'll indulge me again. First Lady Johnson wrote, "The Constitution of the United States does not mention the First Lady. She is elected by one man only. The statute books assign her no duties, and yet, when she gets the job, a podium is there if she cares to use it. I did." So with that.
Perfect. One of my favorite First Ladies, an incredibly active First Lady. And she's absolutely right. In our Constitution, there are 35 words that make up the oath of office for the President of the United States. That's it, 35 words. Not one word about the First Lady. There's no job description, no statutory authority, no responsibilities, no budget, no salary. So each person, but I'm actually a big proponent that position should never be paid, because I really think it gives an open slate for every person that comes into it. First of all, they're not the elected official. They're very important. They are a partner to the presidency. They are advocates for what the president is trying to accomplish. But they get to pick and choose what they want to work on, because there is nothing that is statutory for them to do. So it's an open slate. So each person that comes into the position gets to decide based on their own interests, based on their experiences, based on what the administration, the president is trying to accomplish, and how they can complement that, how they can be an additive and not a distraction. That's one thing no presidential spouse wants to be, is a distraction. They don't want to be in the news for the wrong reasons. They want to be in the news for the right reasons. So it's an opportunity to use this very unique platform that doesn't exist really in our government at any other level. Ronald Reagan used to say, the American people only get one public servant for free, and that's the First Lady. And Pat Nixon called it, the hardest unpaid job in the world. But it's an extraordinary opportunity, and certainly Lady Bird Johnson's quote is a perfect description.
And you go on to talk about that this position is filled with contradictions. Sure. There's limitations but expectations. Mm-hmm. There's traditions, emerging traditions, and there's protocols. And how do they balance, each uniquely, but how they're able to balance that?
And that's one of the things in the book. First of all, we're covering like 250 years of history here and in this book, but it reads very well, and it reads very quickly, but because we have some overarching themes. We do look at what is the status of women in our country over the trajectory of our country's history. How have first ladies who for the first 133 years of our nation's history did not have rights. In fact, the title of the book, remember the First Ladies, actually is a paraphrase from Abigail Adams, who admonished her husband John Adams when he was writing the Constitution, 1787, to remember the ladies and to be kinder to them than your ancestors had been. If not, we would foment a rebellion. Well, the reality is women were not written into the Constitution for 133 years when women got the right to vote. So that's sort of a theme of the book, is how did the women who are in this position bump up against that limitation? And the fact is that they did. They found a way to use their voice. The evolution from not having rights to gaining their voice in the public square through a lot of the social movements and the labor movements, the women's rights movements, and then to ultimately becoming political actors of their own and really being vocal on the stage, up to the point of Hillary Clinton that runs, for the nomination of her party, runs for elective office, the only first lady and only first lady to date to actually, be elected to the Senate, run for the nomination of President of the United States. So again, that's sort of an overarching theme. But the one thing too, you mentioned the protocol. This is a traditional role of this position that's really not to be diminished. It's really important. Diplomacy has a strategic purpose, on the global stage of how we represent ourselves as a nation to foreign visitors or when we visit overseas. Protocol is important. And one of the first ladies that was so excellent at this and really does, I know we're going to talk later about those that got marginalized and not really given the due they deserve, but I'll raise her right now. Pat Nixon was an exceptional diplomat. She is the most traveled first lady in history, 81 countries, one more than Mrs. Clinton. She's the only first lady in our history to be given the title personal representative of the president, officially given that title by the president when she traveled overseas. She addressed parliaments. She brought humanitarian relief to the country of Peru after a devastating earthquake had decimated half the country, killed half the population. And she led the relief efforts, there's pictures of her, we have it in the book, climbing the rubble in Peru in a skirt and high heels. Go figure. But actually what was so extraordinary about the visit, and this was a period of time in the 70s when a lot of countries of South and Central America were very anti-American. very anti-North America, anti-the United States. So the relationships between leaders in these, our president and leaders of these countries was tenuous. But the United States sent humanitarian relief. Mrs. Nixon led the delegation to do that. And the president of Peru at the time made a really profound statement to the media. He said that for the president of the United States to send his wife meant more to us than if he had sent the entire United States Air Force. So that's the power of the platform of the First Lady. They bring a different element, different representation of us, compassion, and really a soft diplomacy.
And to stay on Pat Nixon now, she was not treated kindly within the presidential circle. I mean, if we all think about that time in history, that she was a mirror of to a lot of people.
There were a couple of things too. She wasn't treated kindly. First of all, she was not treated kindly by the women's movement. They never really accepted her. There was the whole Plastic Pat moniker about her because she was very quiet. She was demure. The burgeoning women's movement really didn't know what to make of her. What they didn't really realize is behind the scenes, she was the one pushing for more women to be hired into higher level rankings in their positions in the U.S. government. Under the Nixon administration was the first office of women's issues that had ever been in the White House. So she was a big part of that. But I think, to your point too about how she was treated inside the White House, that was the other difficulty. And that's one of the things we talk about in the book too. Not only what's happening to the status of women in the country, but also how these women are able to be successful in their job or not, depending on how their husband looks at their role. And if they see it as valuable, do they give the support? Does the White House staff give the support to the First Lady? Pat Nixon probably did suffer the most by President Nixon's staff. H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman were terrible to Mrs. Nixon. They diminished her. They really did not give her, they tried to keep her at bay, really did not respect her in the way that she should have. I suspect that Richard Nixon, at the end of, when Pat Nixon passed away, he collapsed over her coffin and just really how much she had done, how much she had not been appreciated in the time that she served. But she was there for every campaign that he did. He probably would not have been president if she didn't help. But regardless, she faced a lot of challenges.
Yeah, probably the most. It's interesting.
Well, Mary Todd Lincoln definitely faced the most. I mean, you're talking about, here's the most revered president in our nation's history, bar none. Any survey, any poll that's done of President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln always ranks at the top, always number one. Mary Todd Lincoln is always at the bottom. Yeah. Which is really unfortunate. Some of it, she self-inflicted, wounds about the, money that she overspent the budget that was given to the White House for refurbishment of the White House when they came in 1861. And she was given money that for 4 years that she spent in 4 months, and it embarrassed her husband in the height of the Civil War.
Yeah, that was tough. But why don't we jump back to the beginning of time?
Yes,
our time.
We've got to talk about
right. So when there was absolutely no roadmap for a first lady, and what the challenges of Martha Washington, Abigail Adams, and Dolly Madison really faced to establish something so completely new. It's fascinating.
Yes.
So.
Great question and great way to start. And I'm sorry, I know we probably should have started with that, but I think you'll definitely will follow along in this. And again, we're talking about our 250th, anniversary of our country. And here, when you mentioned these three women who were there at the beginning, these were, the women who really were our first patriots for the nation. Martha Washington had the burden, of course, of setting precedent for this role. This was an entirely new system, and so did President Washington, of course. This is an entirely new system of government, never been done before, where that the country is actually in the hands of the people. It's the governed that had the power, and not those who were governing. And so the two of them had to create this new role. He was now head of state and head of government. That hadn't happened before either. And he knew immediately, President Washington knew immediately this was a two-person job, and that he needed Martha to help him with the head of state role, the ceremonial role, which again, as I mentioned before, has a strategic purpose, very important. And lucky for him, she was a very skilled social hostess, having been presided over at Mount Vernon and the hundreds of people that were their guests over many, many years, of course, when he served as head of the Continental Army, served in the legislature for Virginia during colonial times. She was very, very skilled. And so, and also I want to say one thing about Martha Washington too, what a patriot she was. Now, she was the person who came to the marriage with the money, because she was a widow and she had inherited, from her husband. She was a wealthy woman, very genteel Southern woman. But during the Revolution, she would go to the battlefields or the encampments, with her husband, giving support to the troops. Really helping, bringing moral support, bringing material support. She gave money of her own that in today's figures would be equivalent to about $250,000 for shoes, clothing, blankets, things that they needed while they're trying to, fight the revolution. And she led a team of other women, of volunteers, to help raise money. So just an incredible patriot. But again, burden of setting precedent to manage sort of this new role of being accessible to the people, but still being formal enough so that we would be accepted on the world stage as a country that sort of met this a status that one would expect for a global power. Followed by Dolly Madison. I'll just say one thing about George Washington and Martha Washington. The way she was not there when he was chosen as president. She was not there for his inauguration. Our first capital, as you know, was in New York. She came about 6 weeks later, traveled up to New York by way of Philadelphia. The new President Washington met her on the banks of New Jersey, I believe it was in Trenton, with a boat, with a big fanfare. He had big fanfare so that it would be recognized by everyone that the way he viewed her position was important. And that set the tone of how this was a partnership. Abigail Adams, who really learned at Martha Washington's feet, she had a harder time being the social hostess. She was a policy advisor. She was a confidant of her husband's. She was the eyes and ears of the revolution. She witnessed the Battle of Bunker Hill. She sacrificed a great deal, long separations from her husband while he was in Philadelphia or or overseas trying to raise money for our revolution. Just incredible. She found it hard to hold her tongue. And in fact, was often referred to as Mrs. President, not in a kind way, but in a critical way, because people at the time felt she had too much influence. Followed by, of course, a Dolly Madison, who was the great unifier. She just she knew how to bring opposing sides together. She used the White House in the most gracious of ways. Her parties were always filled. They were actually called squeezes because you had to squeeze into the room. She served this incredible rum punch. She got people a little loosened up. She would walk the room. She wore these flamboyant clothes, very low cut dresses, a big plume on her head so that people everywhere in the White House could see where Mrs. Madison was. And she would work the room. She'd gather important pieces of information about what was happening on Capitol Hill or happening with his critics, what they were thinking, and she would share that with her husband. I mean, James Madison appreciated Dolly Madison's social skills, but he appreciated her political astuteness even more.
Yeah. And to that, Dolly Madison was really in the heart of the War of 1812. That is a war that we don't always talk about, and she is a hero. So you want to tell that story?
Sure. You know, it is really not legend that she saved the portrait of George Washington. It did happen. The portrait of George Washington was hung in the East Room as the British were advancing on Washington and burned the city of Washington in August of 1814 during the War of 1812. James Madison had left the White House to go survey the troops in Maryland. She is sitting at the White House as the British troops are advancing. They set fire to the Capitol. They set fire to the White House. And she had a big banquet set up for that evening for an event that they were hosting. Well, the British came and they ate her banquet pretty nicely, set fire to the White House, really did a lot of destruction. But before she left, she had the presence of mind to direct her servants, which slaves, our first families were slaveholders, to direct her slaves to cut the portrait of George Washington out of the frame where it was hanging in the East Room, and to roll it up and to take it to safety. Why? Because she knew if it was captured, it would be paraded in the streets of London as a prize of war that the British had really taken down our country. Remember, there was no guarantee our country was going to survive. There were factions, there were internal fighting, there was external fighting, and the early years of our republic. And so she just saved that portrait for a really important reason, but she also had all of the documents that were all of our founding documents were in the White House. There was no archives then. There was no Library of Congress yet. So she had all of those things taken out of the White House and taken away to safety, which is, the founding documents of our nation. She was the nation's first archivist.
She's the first archivist, yeah. And the foresight to have thought that through during attack.
That's right.
It's extraordinary, exactly. The Constitution that she must have really possessed.
Absolutely.
And before we move on from Abigail Adams, Abigail Adams was highly educated,
yes,
and from Massachusetts, and a staunch abolitionist.
Yes.
And
exactly.
And to talk a little bit about that, yeah.
Definitely, yes. As I had mentioned, how our first families were slaveholders except for the Adams. And she was an abolitionist. She could not reconcile how a country founded on freedom could hold people in human bondage. And so they did have African Americans work on their farm, Peacefield in Massachusetts, but they paid them. And she also educated them. And she was the women were not getting formal educations at the time Abigail Adams, was growing up. But her father had an extensive library in their home. And so she was very self-educated and just a remarkable woman. The exchange of correspondence between John Adams and Abigail Adams, which is all digitized and all held at the Massachusetts Historical Society, is really incredible to understand the founding of our country through her eyes, and her contributions was pretty amazing. She again, very political, very, very smart, did not hold back. He also, President, Adams really depended on her for advice. She wasn't always right. She made a couple of mistakes here and there. The Alien and Sedition Act, forcing him to sign it, was a black stain on her tenure. But beyond that, She really was an incredible patriot.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and so actually jumping ahead, because the theme is right, Eleanor Roosevelt, I mean, a champion of civil rights, a champion of, yes, of human rights. Well, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think modeled after the Magna Carta, I believe. So just in the 12 years.
Well, that's it. You hit the you know, the bingo right there. She had 12 years to be First Lady. She had an incredible amount of time, more than any other First Lady before or since, to be able to be the activist that she was. You know, when she became First Lady, this is the last thing that she wanted. She felt, because she was already a very successful person coming into the White House. She had a daily column, she had a weekly radio show, she was a paid speaker, she was a political activist. When Franklin Roosevelt became president, she went to him. She wanted to have a role. And he said no. He did not want her to have a formal role. She found that very constraining. She worried how she was going to be able to be the activist person that she was in this now very constricting position. She did not want to be relegated to hosting teas. It was just not her. But she almost immediately, I think it was within days of becoming First Lady, she said, I'll show you. She hosted the first ever press conference in the White House, only female reporters. She did 348 or 343 press conferences over her tenure with female reporters, because they were locked out of the president's press conferences. And it was a sort of a new industry of you know, more women in the media world, and she wanted to give them a voice. You know, so again, she was involved in some controversial issues for the times, you know, human rights, civil rights, but, you know, she was not to be deterred, and it wasn't easy for her. You know, he was unfaithful to her. There was a lot of very personal, painful moments in the White House, but she was his eyes and ears and legs. He came to value her contributions, how much she did, how much she traveled on his behalf, because it wasn't widely known, of course, that he had polio. It was difficult for him to travel. She went to the Pacific Theater during the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, you know, visited all of our troops. In fact, speaking of Pearl Harbor, hers was the first voice Americans heard on December 7th, 1941, on the attack of Pearl Harbor. The president had put out a statement. It was a Sunday. He had put out a statement. She had her weekly Sunday radio broadcast, which she had done every Sunday. So she did it as usual and really told the country, told particularly the mothers, knowing now that their sons would be and husbands would be going, you know, really off to war, that this was a fight for freedom and a fight for democracy, and the country needed to come together. It was the next day that the president delivered his speech at Congress, the famous Day of Infamy speech. So it's remarkable how her voice, you know, was used. And you mentioned Declaration of Human Rights. All that came after she left the White House. President Truman asked her to lead the delegation on human rights for the new United Nations.
They were extraordinary partners.
Yes.
They had their challenges, as everyone does, but they were extraordinary partners in the White House.
Well, she really believed, it was important for her husband to also run for the fourth term. She knew his health was not good in 1944, but she had been assured by the doctors that he could, with certain modifications, could serve another term, where the reality was he was dying and didn't last very long. But she was willing to support him running again because she felt as the war was nearing its end, it really needed him to bring it to conclusion.
Which is extraordinary. And so then jumping forward a little bit more on the same thing, talking about Jackie Kennedy.
Sure.
I mean, so many of us remember the story of Mrs. Kennedy and her challenges. And I'll add this to it. She also, which was hysterical in the book, did not like the title First Lady. So I'll let you talk a little bit about Mrs. Kennedy.
So the title, of course, the term First Lady really was not used for the first time until the funeral of Dolly Madison in 1849, and President Zachary Taylor eulogized her. It was a state funeral in Washington. The entire city of Washington closed down. All three branches of government sent representatives to her funeral, and President Zachary Taylor did the eulogy and referred to her as First Lady of the land. It was the first time we sort of heard that. And otherwise they were called Mrs. Jefferson, Mrs. Madison, Mrs. Washington, Lady Washington, Mrs. And then it wasn't until the 1890s where the term First Lady really started to stick with Caroline Harrison forward. But Jackie Kennedy, you're right, she wanted to be called Mrs. Kennedy. She did not like the term First Lady. She thought it sounded like a saddle horse, and she did not want that at all. But again, for a young 31-year-old woman coming into the White House as First Lady, you know, her legacy is so profound. And she, you know, chose a topic to work on that her husband did not want her to do, historic preservation. He felt it was too elitist, and people it would not help him politically if she was involved in something like this, going around to rich people, getting them to give money and to donate their works of art. But she held firm. This is what she wanted to do, because she remembered coming to the White House as an 11-year-old girl, visiting the White House for the first time with her mother, walking the rooms of the state floor, room to room, and being so disappointed that there was no guidebook, nothing to tell you about what you were seeing in the White House, the art, the artifacts, and that it wasn't really in great shape. And here she comes, you know, 20 years later as the First Lady, and she does something about it. Historic preservation of the White House is what she selected. She did two incredible things. One, she went on television, February 14th, 1962. More than 60 or 70 million people watched her broadcast with the CBS News correspondent, Charles Collingwood, going room to room in the White House, where she breathlessly, in that voice of hers, described everything, acquisitions that she had been successful in getting, and all the different rooms of the White House, and why it was important for Americans to feel connected to the White House. She knew so much without so much as a note in front of her. And many Americans were seeing the White House for the first time through her. And she encouraged them to support the effort. Kids were sending pennies, they were sending dollars, they were helping, because she knew one thing: there would never, ever be enough government money to maintain the White House at the museum quality that it deserves. You're facing that now. There's never enough government money. Everybody who cares about any institution here, you know, in Bridgeport or anywhere else, philanthropy as a partner to government funding is critical. So she set out to establish the White House Historical Association, which she did in 1961, still in existence. We're in our 63rd year in her honor. We are her living legacy. We've raised hundreds of millions of dollars to protect the White House, the refurbishment of furniture, acquisition of art, the china, the collectibles. We're constantly finding things on auctions artifacts that belong to the White House to this day. Because prior to Mrs. Kennedy, where there was no curator, presidents, they come and go. They can say, I don't like that piece of furniture. They could put it out on the lawn. It could be taken by people. They could give it away. They could destroy it. But we are still finding things. But and the other thing that she did was she published that guidebook. The guidebook that she did not have as an 11-year-old girl. They sold it for $1 in the White House when you walked in on the tours. That guidebook is still being sold. It's in its 35th printing. We are really proud of our publications and the way, you know, we are trying to maintain the White House and the museum quality that she wanted.
And it really led to the Historic Preservation Act of 1966.
Yes, it did.
And the Barnum Museum became a National Historic Landmark only in 2023. It was a 19-year journey, but thanks to Mrs. Kennedy and a few of the first ladies before her, that historic preservation, speaks to, our moment in time, our culture, our identity, our heritage, and that's why it's so important. And give her a lot of credit.
Yes, oh, definitely.
And you write a little bit. Now we're jumping back to 1870s, 1880s. I did not know much about Lucy Hayes, which was my surprise, First Lady, because I came in fully, so, I love Abigail Adams. But learning about Lucy Hayes, I'll let you talk, but she was a historic president, first college graduate.
She is the first lady to graduate from college, Ohio Wesleyan College. She was very focused on women's education, felt that was really important, was a champion for that. She also came into the White House at a time where there were a lot of social movements that were happening. The temperance movement was, of course, one of them. That's where the moniker on her, Lemonade Lucy, because she wasn't serving alcohol, in the White House. She was serving non-alcoholic beverages, but I kind of don't believe it. I think there were definitely parties, maybe that were not public, where alcohol might have been being served. But no, she again was an educated woman, believed in women's rights, believed in women's education. And yes, everybody, I think if you are reading the book, you will find first ladies that surprise you.
Yes.
Their stories that you didn't know were not in any of your history books. And that's our point too. We talk a lot about inclusive history in our country. How could we not include these women and their contributions? So many of these men would not have been president without them. Either their money or their family's connections. Bess Truman is one of them. That was the one that surprised me the most. But even in these periods of time in our country where they didn't have a voice in the public square, they still found a way to push things forward. Here was another one that surprised me. Caroline Harrison in 1890, wife of Benjamin Harrison. She's asked to raise money for Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore, Maryland. And all first ladies are asked to do something philanthropic, right? Or help to raise money. They all do it. But she said yes to that request to support Johns Hopkins Medical School on one condition, that they would admit women to their classes for the first time. And they did. And that's the power of this role.
So speaking of power, that's a great segue. What was really interesting is the story of Edith Wilson. And that's where a First Lady's power and influence is under a magnifying glass. Yeah.
Across the line. That is probably the greatest overreach of power in our history. It's Edith Wilson, after Woodrow, second wife of Woodrow Wilson. Ellen Wilson, his first wife, had died, in the White House, as a number of First Ladies did. But he remarried a Washington socialite, Edith Wilson, who in her memoir claimed that she did not have the power that everyone said that she did. But he had a massive stroke, and for 17 months, no one saw him. His vice president saw him once. Several leaders of the House and Senate saw him once. She was the gatekeeper to everything that came in and everything that went out. And it is extraordinary to think that happened, that extent of her power, of the access of things that went to the president. And who knows, when she would prop him up for some staged photographs, like, with standing over him while he's signing documents. But it's unthinkable now. In our world of 24/7 media, social media, there's nothing like that can ever be hidden again. She disputes it, but it's pretty indisputable. There is a fantastic book out about Edith Wilson. It's incredibly well researched, and it's hard to dispute her power. Because of that, and then also because of the assassination of President Kennedy is why, of course, we have the 25th Amendment of the incapacity if there were to be the president was, and vice president either killed or incapacitated, what the line of succession is.
Yeah. So before we move on to the next First Lady, a point that you bring up through each of the stories is not all of the First Ladies were terribly happy about this stepping into the role. They were traditional home workers. It seemed like they rose to the occasion, but it was a challenge that they all had to examine and then take.
I mean, it's hard to think about, and for people who were not involved in politics before to step, into this role where all of a sudden all eyes are on you, and everything that you say and do, is heavily scrutinized, and you worry in these positions. You worry about the health and safety and security of your family. That is always overarching, in your mind. But like Lady Britt Johnson said, you could either buckle under that, or you could realize you have this podium and you want to use it. And they really do want to be known for something that they, can add or contribute to their husband's presidencies. But of course, it's not easy, but it is a privilege. Barbara Bush, she told her staff when she became First Lady on the first day, said, I want to do something that helps people every single day. That was her simple mission. And so together with her staff, they figured that out, how she can do something that was helpful to the country, every single day.
Every single day. Well, why don't we continue? I want to talk a little bit about Betty Ford, but while we're talking about the Mrs. Bushes and their moments in time, I mean, Barbara Bush, extraordinary. And she stepped in, some terrific stories. I want to talk about the Wellesley College one, but I even as young as I was in my teens, that she stepped into the AIDS crisis.
Yes.
Fearlessly.
That's right. Early on.
Mm-hmm.
That was within, weeks of being a new First Lady. Barbara Bush went to an AIDS orphanage in Washington, D.C. It's called Grandmother's House. And there, and this is where people who were dying of AIDS were being cared for. And of course, this was a period of time in 1989 where the AIDS, crisis was one where people were afraid to be around people who had AIDS. They didn't understand it. And the previous years under the Reagan administration, where there was a lot of, activism against that the president and the administration was not doing enough about this disease. So here, this is March, I think, of 1989. Barbara Bush goes to this orphanage in Washington, D.C., and is soothing, that picture's in the book too, soothing a crying baby who was dying of AIDS, who subsequently did die. And without uttering a word, it just sent this message, you don't have to be afraid, that they need our love, our compassion, our support. And it was, and the media at the time, the press at the time, really caught on to just how extraordinarily brave that act was. And Barbara Bush was very good about doing things, even though she was a person who didn't hold back her tongue either, and got herself into trouble oftentimes, having differences of opinion of something that her husband was doing. She always felt she got into trouble, but she did some things without uttering a word that were very impactful. One other story I'll tell you, and this was the first Christmas that the Bushes were in the White House, so that was December 1989. Barbara Bush had read in the newspapers how that the shopping malls around the country were no longer going to be allowing the Salvation Army bell ringers to come and take money in their little red buckets. So what did she do? She told her press secretary, I want to go to Mazza Gallery, the mall that was in Washington, D.C. It's not there anymore. And she just went to drop money in the bucket and took the press with her. And that the Secretary General of the Salvation Army called her after that and thanked her and just said that turned everything around. Those bell ringers were in that mall, in all those malls, and to this day are still doing that, and without uttering a word. But she just knew the first, again, power of the First Lady's platform on a small act like that.
And another picture that you have in here is she went to Kuwait. She went into an active war zone to visit the troops at Thanksgiving.
Yes, they went where they were staged in Saudi Arabia, and where our troops were during the Gulf War, right? And in her memoirs, she writes that that was probably the best Thanksgiving that they ever had, sitting amongst the troops. And there she is in fatigues and boots, but her pearls. She had her pearls on. It's just, that was quintessential Barbara Bush. And, so there are several First Ladies in our history who, went to war zones. I guess we can say Dolly Madison really was the first, because the war came to her in the White House. And then, of course, Eleanor Roosevelt went to active theater of war. Pat Nixon went to Vietnam. Laura Bush went to Afghanistan.
Yeah. So, I mean, courageous.
Yeah, those are acts. Those are acts of courage. In fact, a great act of courage, not a war. Although the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was tearing the country apart, and Lyndon Johnson thought he was going to lose the Democratic Party for decades to come in the South, because he signed the Civil Rights Act. And it was Lady Bird Johnson who got on a train and traveled 9 states from Alexandria, Virginia to New Orleans, Louisiana, campaigning for her husband in 1964. That's why he was running for his first full election. And just to support him, but to support the Civil Rights Act, she felt that the Southern people in the Deep South would accept her, be kinder to her than they would to her husband. In fact, that trip was deemed too dangerous for Lyndon Johnson to do, but she did it, and a train traveled ahead of her, 15, 20 minutes ahead of her, because of bomb threats, but she went.
So we've got about 10 minutes left, but there's a couple of stories. I just thought this was wonderful, and I want to read this for the ladies in the room tonight, sorry. Could you just cue up the Wellesley? I have the quote here if you want to read it, or I can read it, but if you want to cue that story up.
Sure, so every First Lady gets, and presidents too, get asked to do commencement addresses at colleges every year. Barbara Bush and her team, they received a lot of requests, and she selected the ones she was going to do, a combination of high schools and colleges. One of the ones she accepted was Wellesley College, and this is 1990. And it caused, I don't know if anybody remembers that, but it caused an incredible uproar amongst the student body. It's a women's college. They protested against it, said the only reason why she, has any notoriety is through her husband, not through anything that she did of her own. Remember, she quit college as a 19-year-old. She married, George Bush, as she says, in her memoir. In war, in time of war, you just don't wait. And she just wanted to be married. She wanted to be with George Bush. So she gave up her education. She was at Smith College, and got married and had children. Never regretted any of her decisions, but it caused such an uproar at the school. And it was in the press every day, every day, every day. And she could have said, okay, I won't come. But what did she do? She picked up the phone and she called the woman at Wellesley, the young student at Wellesley who was leading the protest, and spoke to her for over an hour. And remember, nobody had cell phones then. She got the girl on her dorm, hall phone and talked with her. And just said, look, I understand where you are coming from, but let me explain why I made my choices. And that she didn't, regret her choices in life. So again, the protest is building, it's building, it's building. Mrs. Bush goes and delivers the speech. She had no idea it was being carried live by every network that day. I was in the White House then. I remember watching it. We all were watching it. It was a very brief speech. About 12 minutes, but she turned around a negative situation to the point where She basically had a standing ovation at the end. She used humor. She said, look, I know that you did not want me to come, that you were expecting, the person who wrote The Color Purple, instead, which, was the hot book at the time, Alice Walker's book. She said, instead you got me, known for the color of my hair. And everybody just started laughing. She started to diffuse the heat and turn down the heat of this very tense moment. And then she went about saying, look, at the end of your life, you're not going to remember one more deal that you closed, one more business transaction, one more, all these professional things she listed. But you will remember, were you there for a spouse? Were you there for a family member? Were you there for a friend? And then she said, life is about choice, and then ended it by saying, you're welcome to read the quote.
That's very generous of you.
You can go ahead.
Do you want me to? Okay.
Go ahead.
This is great for me. So her intentions, saying to the graduates, to be the first to realize her dream, not society's dream, but her own personal dream. Mrs. Bush went on to say, and who knows, somewhere out in this audience may even be someone who will one day follow in my footsteps and preside over the White House as the president's spouse. And I wish him well.
Yeah. It was great. That speech is considered one of the top 100 rhetorical speeches of the 20th century. As is the speech by Hillary Clinton in Beijing at the Women's Conference there, and 2 by Eleanor Roosevelt when she post First Lady, the Human Rights speech. But it is incredible and well deserved.
So with that, we're at about time.
Yes.
We could go on and on.
I know.
There's no stopping this, But with that, because we'll open it up to some questions, and I asked you if we could do this. There is, pardon my notes, there's a quote from your book.
Okay.
If you could read this, it was beautifully done during the Writers' Festival that you had done. And I have it here,
Okay.
and I hope you can read it. I've got it highlighted in yellow.
Oh, perfect.
But this is Jackie Kennedy, and I'll
yes.
allow you to cue it up.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
starting down here.
Okay. So this was a fascinating revelation in the research of our book. Of course, we think of Jackie Kennedy as this iconic, beautiful woman focused on culture and fashion and style. And all of that is true. And I do remember asking Caroline Kennedy at one point, what would your mother want to be remembered for? And she said she's known as a style icon, but she would want to be remembered for her expansive knowledge of history, which was really interesting. The revelation that we've also found in our research was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was before the world knew that the Cold War seemed to be sliding toward nuclear conflict. Mrs. Kennedy was at their weekend home in Virginia when the president called her to suggest she come back to the White House. She learned that the Soviets were installing missiles in Cuba aimed at American cities. The First Lady was prepared to die and begged her husband not to send her and the children away, preferring she and their children die with you than live without you. The Secret Service had well-established plans to protect the president, his family, and key members of the government in the event of an emergency. Relocating to a bomb shelter on site or to an undisclosed off-site location would be determined by the nature of the threat. In his book, Mrs. Kennedy and Me, Clint Hill, Mrs. Kennedy's Secret Service agent, reports that Mrs. Kennedy was emphatic about what he could expect if the situation required her and the children to be relocated to a shelter. I will take Caroline and John, and we will walk hand in hand out onto the South grounds. We will stand there like brave soldiers and face the fate of every other American. It's pretty profound.
Powerful, powerful. So extraordinary what you learn in this book. And we'll have time for a few questions, if that's okay with you.
Of course, if everybody would like that.
But a huge hand for Anita McBride. Welcome home. Thank you. My goodness, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all. We jumped around a lot, but I hope it gave you a taste for what you'll find in the book.
So does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask Anita? Happy to do it. I mean, I'm wondering.
Sure.
I can jump in first. That's always a good icebreaker.
Sure.
You've spoken at all the presidential libraries and museums all over, a lot of them. Was there something that an audience member shared with you that gave you an aha moment or not? Was there a surprise for you?
There was one funny question I got. Somebody had asked, how does the First Lady order her Christmas gifts? Like, where do they go? How do they get delivered? Where do they go? And, knowing all the security that's around, that actually was kind of funny. No, I think people are interested to know what life is like behind, those White House walls. We know what we see in public, but what are they like, in their private life? And I try, tell people, look, they are mothers and fathers and family members like everybody else. It's important for those of us that are working on the staff of a president or first lady to really be cognizant of that when we're scheduling them or bringing ideas to them of things that they need to go do, is to build in that time for them to be with their friends, to be with their family, to be grounded. I mean, first ladies care a lot about that. I knew, the president's schedule, President Bush's schedule, George W. Bush's schedule was pretty regular. They were super, super early risers, and he was exercised, hard in the morning. He was at work by 6:30 in the morning. She was an early riser too, but we were busy, during the days. But I would know what the president's schedule was, and if there was a break or he was, coming home to work out or something, we knew not to have anything on Mrs. Bush's schedule at that moment, because she would want, to have those few moments with him. Most first families are like that.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Mm-hmm.
They're human beings at the end of the day. Let's remember, no matter who it is, every problem in the world comes to the desk of the American president. It really does. It's intense.
So does anybody have a question? Yes, you can
Yes,
pick.
Were there any presidents that you found in your research that really blocked the agendas of the first ladies?
Great question. Calvin Coolidge did not want Grace Coolidge, his wife, who was a very accomplished woman. She was a teacher of deaf children. She was highly educated. She loved baseball. She was a woman who had many interests. He did not want her to have a public role, and it was too bad. She was an extraordinarily beautiful woman with a lovely personality, really would have complimented and helped him work. He's known as Silent Cal. He didn't have much of a personality, but he did not really want her to have a public role. She found, ways to have an impact, raising money for schools for deaf children and, things like that she cared about, but did not have, really an opportunity to really, I think, help benefit his administration more than she could have. So he's one that tried to prevent her some. Again, I gave you the example of the Nixon administration, and it's not that the president didn't appreciate Pat Nixon, he really did, but he allowed his staff to overshadow her, which was important and unfortunate. And that is one thing we really do try and hone in on the book, are those presidents who really did want their spouses to have a role, to help them, because they knew that they needed it. Yes, sir.
Excuse me. I've got your book. I've started reading. I read
Yes.
about half of it.
Oh, wow,
And,
thank you.
Have enjoyed it. I've read a lot of biographies about presidents, so I knew
Yeah.
some of the stuff, but there's always more to learn.
Right.
And the thing is, what I noticed about
Yeah.
it was that I knew that you were that you worked with Laura Bush, I guess it was. So obviously you were a Republican, but that didn't come through in the book. You know,
No.
it was not political at all. You were equally
Thank you.
appreciative of what the Democratic as well as Republicans did, which is getting rare. But what
Yeah.
I learned tonight that I didn't know
Yes.
is that you were on the board of the White House Preservation Society.
The Historical Society, yes. Yes.
Historical Preservation Society?
It's the White House Historical Association.
Okay.
Yes.
But does it have to do with preservation of the White House?
There is another committee at the White House, which is called Committee for Preservation of the White House. It's separate.
Okay,
It's
yeah.
presidentially appointed. We are not. We're a nonprofit and nonpartisan.
Okay. Yeah, my
So,
question won't work.
yes.
I was going to ask you what you thought about the
Changes going
in the
on.
Oval Office.
I get those questions a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer it, and I'll tell you, and you're right. First of all, thank you for the comment about this is a very nonpartisan book. We show the strengths, we show the weaknesses, the successes, the failures of each of them. Again, I didn't even mention one of my favorite first ladies is Rosalind Carter. First of all, because of her, there was an actual office of the First Lady. She really pushed for a budget for the office of the First Lady. She had a staff. She was the first to hire a director of the office, which eventually became a chief of staff. So I'm grateful to her. She was the first to put her office in the East Wing to work alongside her staff. What was so interesting about her being able to do that was that, you know, her husband, Jimmy Carter, campaigned on cutting the White House staff. And here she was increasing it. And in both their books, they said this is the only thing in their marriage they ever fought about, was that. So I'm very grateful to Mrs. Carter and had the privilege of meeting her on a couple of occasions too. But yes, there are, so the structure in the White House, if you know, any changes, additions ever that are done, the Committee for Preservation of the White House is a group of experts that review any of the requests that there are by the curator, by the chief usher of the White House, by the president, by the First Lady, of anything that they want to acquire for the White House, any changes that they want to make. Things generally have to be approved. If it's approved, then it comes to us at the Historical Association and we can fund it if it's in our mission. We can't fund construction. That's not in our mission. We're collections, acquisition, art, China, refurbishment, restoration, education mission. So as far as the Oval Office, since there's been an Oval Office, which has been since William Howard Taft, I mean, there's been a West Wing since President Teddy Roosevelt. The West Wing was built to accommodate a growing staff of the president. But the Oval Office, as we know it, was during the Taft administration. Every president from that point forward gets to decorate it the way that they want, because it's changed by every president. That they don't change the footprint, but they can change how they want to decorate it. There's a White House budget for that. The White House Historical Association really doesn't get involved in the Oval Office. The Rose Garden. The Rose Garden is, of course, it has gone through many iterations. It wasn't always called that, but there was always a garden there. There was space there. There were greenhouses there. There were sheep grazing on there in some administrations, in the Wilson administration during World War I. So it's gone through many changes over the history of our White House. It was formalized to look like the way we know it in the Kennedy administration. President Kennedy wanted that space to be an extension of the Oval Office, to be that would be worthy of a global stage for diplomatic ceremonies, for press conferences. And so the structure as we know it, the design under the Kennedy administration with Bunny Mellon, their friend who was an incredible horticulturist, helped to design it. We, hasn't had many changes since 1962 when that happened. Mrs. Trump did made changes to the garden in 2020 that she was actually criticized for very unfairly, I must say, for this reason. I know for the administrations I worked into, we kicked the can down the road for the things that needed to be done there. Plants were dying, trees were dying, the irrigation system wasn't working, it wasn't accessible, ADA compliant for people in wheelchairs to be able to get there. The electricity for any press conferences had to be brought by, big wires from the press room that, across the grass. It needed to be enhanced. We needed to have appropriate irrigation, electrical supply, access for people in wheelchairs. In order to do that, everything had to be cut down. And of course, it looked terrible for a while, and she was vilified for it. But I think at that point in the administration, I think she felt, I'm damned if I do and I'm damned if I don't, so I'm going to do it anyway. And everything came back in beautiful, form. The flowers are great, the trees are great, everything was fine. This change of taking out the grass and putting in a patio is dramatic. I'm the first one to say that it is dramatic. I just prefer to have green space and to have the green grass. The one thing I will say about that is that can be reversed. If another president comes in and wants to say, I want to put the grass and take the concrete out, that can be done. Because the footprint of the Rose Garden has not changed. The ballroom is a whole nother thing. I guess I'll tell you, a couple of things. Through our history, we have definitely had presidents who have made enhancements, who have made changes to the White House, and they were criticized. Number one, Harry Truman, when he put the balcony on the second floor so that the first families can have a private space to sit outside, he was really criticized heavily for that. The Congress refused to give him the money for it. And so he found money from other federal agency budgets that he had redirected to build the Truman balcony. We cannot imagine the White House without that Truman balcony today. So I think just to put things in perspective, the ballroom now is, here's how I'll describe this. The White House, East Wing, West Wing, residence, as we know it today, as it stands today, is about 99,380 square feet, those three structures. The new ballroom alone will be 90,000 square feet. So it is hard to imagine that and it's going to be on the East Wing side of the White House. So the East Wing, as we know it, where the traditional First Lady's offices are, built in 1945 by Franklin Delano Roosevelt to accommodate an even bigger growing White House staff, that will be gone. So I'm having a hard time envisioning how it'll all work. Two things. I do know from having worked in a White House 3 different times, it is very difficult to host a state dinner in the state dining room for more than 134 people. It's very limiting. And I think we have seen over the years, the Clintons, the Obamas, the Bidens did this all the time. They erected large tents out on the lawn for their state dinners. They had to put in flooring, the access from the White House to the event, big structures, tenting structures, all the catering, the supplies that are required, plus the damage to the lawn after you're taking everything down. It's not insignificant. So it's not unreasonable to think we needed a larger space. this is really large. And I just, I have seen the renderings, maybe you've seen them too, they're public. They are very much in keeping with the architectural design of the White House itself, the Roman classic design. The architect who's been selected to do the design is well known for that, that style of architecture. It's just, yes, that will not be easy to reverse or ever reverse. There is apparently no government money for it. It's being raised privately. We know we're not, funding it from the Historical Association, but the money is being raised privately. The Congress is not appropriating money for that.
And it's a tough time to raise money, let me tell you right now.
I know, but it's going to be done. Now, once it's built, then we will have to play a role, likely for the China service, for any of the, artistic elements that are there. We'll see. We haven't been asked for anything yet.
Yeah, 90,000, that could accommodate, calculated.
650 or 750
I was going to say
people,
about
I think.
800 people. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a big jump from 130.
Yeah, definitely.
So with that,
Yeah.
any final thoughts?
No, I know I take very long to answer questions, but I just want you to, have as much information as possible to pique your interest in this book. I think you'll love the stories of these women through every era of our nation's history. And the one point that Kathy made at the beginning, we are inching towards our 250th anniversary in July. Those of you who, were alive to enjoy and remember how we felt as a country at the bicentennial, it's very important for all ages to be engaged in really honoring the country's history. I think the most important thing we can do is encourage the civic education at all levels to understand our founding, understand the principles of the founding documents. I mean, frankly, I think it would be terrific if every single high school student, maybe even younger, take the citizenship test to know what those questions are and be able to answer them. And if they can't, then where are we falling short in our education that our kids don't know, how the country was founded? How can you defend a nation that you don't understand what it's about? Thank you. Anyway, but thank you all for your patience and listening. I know we went way over.
And thank you so much. You've been a champion of the Barnum Museum long before
Love the Barnum Museum.
2007.
Support the Barnum Museum. For sure.